Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Jill Barron and I'll be running the session today. Just to let you know, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. So I'll put myself back onto mute, but if you need to run and grab a quick cup of coffee, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Good morning everyone and welcome to this session on presenting figures effectively. My name is Jill Barron. I'm just going to pop the camera on for a second so that I can you can see me for a few moments. I'm going to turn the camera off in just a minute just so that it doesn't cause problems with people's software and you don't spend the session looking at the top of my head as I'm looking at my notes. But I just wanted to say hello and welcome to this session. The next 45 minutes or so, what I'm going to be doing is giving you some tips, some thoughts, some ideas on how you can present your figures more effectively. It's a huge subject, so we're going to be just dipping our toe into the water, talking about a few of the areas, but obviously there's far more to say on the subject. So let me just turn the webcam off. So you just listen to my voice for the rest of the session and to look at what we've got on the screen. Now, why are we running this session today? Well, this is a subject that's really close to my heart. I think actually, as we get more and more information thrown at us from all the different sources that we get, it's become increasingly important that when we have to communicate something, whether it's numbers or words or whatever it is, that we can find a way to engage with our audience, give them what they want, present it effectively if we want to get them to hear our message. So, as I said, broad subject, I could go into things like storytelling. All I'm going to try and do here today is give you some top tips, some things to think about that you can do and to change immediately that will make your figures more effectively presented. I was on the tube on the way here this morning and I had some tube problems. And I was thinking about the amount of information you can get these days when there's problems with the tubes. And I went onto my phone and I opened up the tube map to look at an alternative route. And the tube map really is a very iconic way of presenting information. For those of you who don't live in London, you've probably come across it. It's on a lot of branding these days. The Transport for London have made a fortune out of merchandising. But the map itself contains a lot of information. So I'm going to ask you a quick question. I'm going to open up a poll and ask my first quick question. For those of you who are familiar with the tube map, does the tube map have grid lines? And if you can just answer yes, no, or I don't know. And we'll see what we come up with. So far about 50% of you have voted, so I'll give you a couple more seconds just to get your thoughts down. And then I'll close the polling and I'll show you the results. Okay, so far, most of you have said no. I'm going to close the poll now. And I'm going to share the results with you. So 60% of you said no, 20% yes, and 20% I don't know. Well, for those of you who said yes, you're right. Now, not all tube maps have grid lines, but certainly the ones that you download off the website or you have on a piece of paper you can pick up at the station still, and some of the stations as well have grid lines. But it's very rare you actually notice them because they are very, very pale, very much in the background. So you only really see them when you're looking for them, looking for a reference for station, for example. Most of the time, what you see is the richer, brighter information of the tube lines. And I was thinking that's actually a really good way of thinking about presenting figures effectively. Giving information in a way that allows people to take away from it what they need to, without the other stuff getting in the way. So next time you are in the tube, have a look. There are grid lines. There's also bands of pale grey around it showing the different zones you're in. And then also, obviously, the tube lines. So let's just hide those results and go back to the main screens. So just a little bit about me. My name's Jill, as I said. I'm an accountant by background. I spent many years as an auditor before I moved across to be a management consultant. And then more recently, I've been a trainer. And one of the things I've been doing a lot of is helping finance and non-finance people speak to each other. And a big part of that, for me, is around how we present numbers, particularly to non-finance people. As I said, the session is going to be about 45 minutes long. We don't have too many people on the call today, so that's great. I have still muted everyone as they've come in to prevent background noise, people chewing on their sandwiches, etc. If you'd like me to unmute you, then if you want to raise your hand, I can do that. Or you can chat to us by dropping your thoughts in the question box or in the chat box. So my first question for you this morning is, can you put your hand up if you can hear me okay? And then I know that people have dialed in okay. So if you haven't found it, there's a little button under the attendee box to the right-hand side of your screen. Almost everyone has put their hand up, a couple haven't, but I'm guessing that means that our sound at our end is okay. So thank you very much for that, and I'll pop the hands down now. So if you do have a question, drop it in the question box to the side. Either myself or Matt, who is my colleague sitting next to me, will attempt to answer the question as we go along. And if we don't get a chance, then I will stay online for 5–10 minutes at the end of the session and wrap up any questions we haven't already covered. Right, so what are we going to cover today? As I said, it's a huge subject. But the aim of this session is to give you some thoughts to take away, get you thinking about some of these areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of audience when presenting figures effectively. It's a very obvious thing to say, but we need to think about our audience if we're going to engage and communicate with them properly. I'll give you some thoughts on structuring and formatting tables to improve the clarity and the impact. We'll also talk about how we can present numbers, graphs and slides a little bit more clearly, and I'll round off with some best practice formatting. What I would say is these are really my thoughts. They are based on quite a lot of experience, quite a lot of time spent looking at financial information, but feel free to disagree with me. If you want to disagree, put your hand up and I'll mute you and you can shout at me, or you can drop something in the chat box or in the question box. I'm more than happy for people to push back. I think the main thing is that people are thinking about things rather than just presenting things as they always have done or per the standard templates for your organisation. Right, so let's think about who the audience is. It is a common myth that finance people like data and numbers and non-finance people don't. They like visuals. But actually, that's exactly what it is. It's a myth. Different people do have a tendency to absorb information in different ways, but I think it's quite unhelpful to make sweeping generalizations about our audience. The key driver and the key thing we need to know about our audience is what they need to know. So, for example, even a highly visual person will sometimes need to know the detailed data. Understanding what the audience's objectives are is going to lead you to present the information in a way which is most likely to meet their needs. How do we find out? Well, we can ask them if that's a possibility. May not be the case. But if we can't ask them, there are other ways we can think about it. So we might, for example, think about questions or queries they've come back to us on previous occasions that might indicate what it is they need to find out. The tendency, certainly I think from the finance teams I've worked for or with in the past, the tendency has just been to give loads and loads of information in the hope that somewhere in there is buried what people need to know. But obviously that's not particularly useful, and we can make ourselves a lot more user-friendly by just pulling out the key information. There's a great article in the Harvard Business Review, if any of you have come across that, by a gentleman called Jim Stikelether, and he talks about breaking down audiences into a number of different categories. So you'll have your novices who are just on their exposure to a particular subject, and they want simplified but not oversimplification. So these might be, for example, people you come across who have no finance background that you're talking to about finance topics. And then you have your generalists, you have your managers who might need things in a bit more detail, you have your experts, and you have your executives who need the information but in a high-level summarised form. So one thing you can do is think about your audience in that context to help you distill the information you want to present. And then once you know what they need to know, you can decide what you want them to know. So they need to make a decision about a number of different options, for example. What is it that you want them to decide? And you can then use the numbers, the figures to influence if that's appropriate. Now, some of this sounds quite obvious, but I make no apologies for saying it, because again and again and again, I see people get very focused on the task and the numbers, and they don't really think about who's going to end up looking at that and using it. So we've thought about our audience and what they need to know. We've thought about what key messages we want to communicate to them. The next thing we need to do is think about how we can best achieve that. And one thing I would say is, once you've worked out what you want them to know, I would physically write it on a piece of paper somewhere, so you can come back at the end when you've prepared your report or prepared your presentation, just to check actually those key messages come across. So how can we best achieve presenting our figures or our financial information? There are a number of different ways. You can use text, so you can actually just write the words down. And I think this is one form that is sometimes undervalued, and actually sometimes it is just quicker, easier and clearer to write things down in a narrative form. We can use tables, and we can use graphs. And all this could be presented in reports or presentations. So a document that someone will take away and read, or something that you will talk them through. Now, just in the chat box, if you just want to jot down as we go through, when you think it's best to use a table and when you think it's best to use a graph. And I'll keep talking, going through the slides, but if you can just jot down your thoughts in the chat box or in the question box, and we'll see what people are thinking. Right, so what I'm going to show you next is a table. And this is a fairly standard table, one that you've probably come across something very similar at some point in your career. I've got a list of expenditure, I've got some actuals and budgets for the month, I've got some year-to-date actuals and budgets as well. What I'd like you to tell me, and I'm going to open my second poll here, is what do you think of this table? Is it great? Is it the best table you've ever seen? Is it okay? Is it good? Or is it just really rubbish and you hate it? I haven't given you a fifth option of, really, I've got better things to do with my life than have an opinion about a table, but I'd like to just express some sort of opinion. But about 80% of you voted, so I'll give it a couple more seconds to get everyone else's thoughts. I think everyone's voted is going to, so I'm going to close this down. I'm going to share the results, and it's no surprise to me that actually most of you have said it's okay. A few of you think it's rubbish, but most of you think it's okay, because this is actually fairly typical of what we see. Let me hide those and go back to our screen. Excuse me. So, fairly typical. Actually, it's fine, isn't it? It gives us the information we need. But I think there are some ways that we can make this clearer and better for the reader, to be able to communicate our key messages, but also to make it more pleasant to read. So have a look at that and just spend a couple of seconds just thinking about what you think we could do to make that table better. And then I'll show you my example, which you can then feel free to criticise or comment on, but I think makes the numbers just a bit easier to understand. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Again, drop things in the chat box or the question panel if you've got thoughts. And thank you. Lisa said, we use a table where the recipient needs to know all the detail and graphs when the pattern is more relevant. Absolutely. So tables for detail, graphs for patterns or relationships. So this is what I've done to this table. I've made a few changes, and the formatting's got slightly odd as it's gone into a slide, so apologies for that. What have I done to this table? Well, I have done a number of things. Probably the most obvious one is I've got rid of those heavy grid lines. Now, just like on the tube map, we don't want heavy grid lines to interfere with the rest of the information, so I've removed most of them, and what I've put in are some paler grey ones. Now again, this is a personal thing. I'm not a big fan of grid lines. I know a lot of people are. If you want to keep grid lines, that's absolutely fine. I would put them in pale grey, and probably I'm more likely to keep the horizontal ones than the vertical ones. Because if you start putting vertical grid lines in, oh, I can't draw in a straight line. It's a bit like putting heavy grid lines between words in a sentence. It just interferes with our vision a little bit. So that's the first thing I've done, and that's purely cosmetic. I've also added a bit of white space, which is cosmetic, and I've right aligned the numbers so all the decimal places line up. Again, that's fairly cosmetic. The other thing I've done is I've reordered the columns. So I've put together numbers which I'm assuming we would want to compare. So the monthly actual and monthly budget figures for September, and then the same for the year to date. So I'm assuming we want to compare those columns, so I've put them together. And I've also assumed that actually our September actual column is the most important. That's what we want to focus on. So I've put that to the far left on the basis that in the Western world, certainly, that's where our eye is drawn. I've also reordered the columns, sorry, the rows. So I've now put salaries at the top because that's the biggest number for the September actuals. so I'm assuming that's the most important information. If actually we were more concerned in the variances, then I would put the one with the largest variance at the top. So the information in the top left-hand corner is the most important, because that's the way we read. So that's just a couple of things I've changed, and a lot of it's cosmetic. The rearranging of the columns means that we are just helping it for the reader to pull out the key message. Let me get rid of all those drawings. And what this means is I can shrink that down to quite a small size. I could probably go quite a lot smaller than that, and you would still be able to see it clearly. And that means you can pop things in the body of a report or the body of even a presentation if it's a simple table, without losing the ability to read it. And it means we don't have to stick everything back in an appendix at the back of a document and have people flicking backwards and forwards. A couple of other things I can also do. Here I have added a title. Now, in fact, I've added two titles. The bottom one, so Analysis of September Spend, is a literal title. It's telling you what you're seeing, and ideally you'd also add a source there as well. But the top one, Spend Close to Budget, is what we would call a leading title. So it's telling the reader what it is that we think they should take away from this chart, because then we know that when they look at the numbers, that's the information they're pulling out. So a leading and little title is going to be useful for the reader to understand what we're looking at. So that's just a very, very few thoughts on tables and how we can, just by thinking about what the most important information is, we can highlight that, draw it out, and also how we can think a little bit about formatting. First of all, makes it easier to read generally, but also means we can shrink things down and keep them next to relevant text. So let's think about graphs. So tables are good when we need data. Graphs are good when we are trying to show a relationship or a pattern, or how things change at a high level over time, for example. Now let me open another poll, and this one is, what's your favourite type of graph, if you have one? And while you're filling that, I will caveat what I'm going to say next, because actually I have some pretty strong views about graphs. And a lot of people disagree with me, and I'm guessing some of you on the call will probably disagree with me as well, and that's fine. If you have a favourite type of graph, keep using it, by all means, but what I'm trying to do in this next session, or section, is just to flag to you some of the things to be wary of when you are using them, to try and avoid some of those pitfalls. So again, most of you have voted. I'll give you 5 seconds or so for those of you who are still agonising over what your favourite type of chart is. And unsurprisingly, I close this down and share it with you. Unsurprisingly, 41% of you say they don't have a favourite type of graph. Nobody said other. Sometimes I get people saying things like, I like waterfall charts, or I like, and they name a chart that I've never even heard of. But broadly speaking, they're variations on the ones we've just mentioned. So 41% don't have a favourite graph, and that's probably a positive thing. 18% like bar charts, 29% line graphs, 12% pie charts. So thank you for that. As I said, I have some strong views, and actually my favourite type of graph is a line graph. And I'm going to talk you through why that's the case, and I'm also going to talk you through why I don't like some of the other types, and actually some caveats around using the other ones. So bar charts. Bar charts are great. Bar charts are really useful. I don't have any problem with bar charts. What I do have a bit of a problem with is what we call cluster bar charts. So this is an example of my hot drink sales, tea, coffee and hot chocolate over a year. Now my issue with this is I don't really know what I'm trying to get from it. Am I trying to see how sales of coffee change over time? Or am I supposed to be looking at the relative proportions, the relative sales of each of the types of drink in each month? In either case, it's not particularly useful. I can probably see what the sales are of coffee, but trying to look at hot chocolate, I've got all these other lines in the way, so it's hard to pick things out. Now this is the Excel default when I set up this chart, and it's much nicer than it used to be. If you're using an old version of Excel, it would give you a grey background. One of the columns would probably be yellow, which isn't an ideal colour. There'd be lots of grid lines. This is much cleaner, so from a formatting purpose, it looks quite nice, but it's not really communicating the information particularly clearly. So my preference would be to pop it on a line graph, which I think shows the same information much more clearly. So my default would always be a line graph. I don't think you always need to use a line graph, but I would always use that as a starting point and think about if that's the best way to present the information. Now, what I quite often see is a line graph, and people have added data points. Because actually we can't trace across, and we need to trace across, and we need to say, actually, I need to know what this number here, or what this number here is, or what this number here is. Add some grid lines so people can read across. That's fine, as long as they're fairly faint or a paler colour. At the point at which you start adding data points, I think what you're saying is we need the data, we need the detail, rather than having a trend. In that case, I say just use a table. They're not as sexy, they're not as colourful usually, but actually if that's the information people need, that's the information people need. So I'm not a big fan of cluster charts. What I'm even less of a fan of, is something called stacked bar charts. Now, I don't see as many of these as I used to, but I still see them cropping up now and again, often in places like annual reports. And what this is trying to show me is, I believe, how the total of hot drink sales is made up of each type of hot drink. But actually, if I want to know how many or what percentage is coffee or is tea, tea is probably, I can tell because it's at the bottom, so I can just look at the axis. But because each of these coffee ones is starting in a different position, it's really hard to see overall. So I think it's going to be quite confusing. And actually, the Economist Guide to Numbers, which is a brilliant guide to presenting numbers, I highly recommend it. They say that stacked bar charts are a good way to hide a bad number. So if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to disguise the fact that, for example, your hot chocolate sales are terrible, by all means use a stacked bar chart, but otherwise I would generally avoid them. Now, the exception to that is if you are using them to show percentage of the total. So let's say football possession, how that football possession is split over 100%, or to show the breakdown of 100% of votes in an election, for example. That kind of thing, okay, but when you're trying to show it over a period of time and you're using them for each month, for example, over time series, then it's just confusing. I used to work with a colleague who was always very impressed with his stacked bar charts. But I tend to think if you're impressed with your graph, you've probably spent more time thinking about formatting and how whizzy it looks than how good it's going to be at engaging and communicating with your audience. And bear in mind that we're here to inform rather than impress. 12% of you said you liked pie charts. I was surprised actually that wasn't higher. I see pie charts so often in reports. Here's an example of a pie chart. And pie charts are great at showing broadly the split of a total. So here I can see broadly half of my sales are coffee, broadly a quarter are tea, and broadly a quarter are made up of other drinks. And that's okay because I've only got 5 segments there. If I had 15 or 20 segments, that's going to be much harder to understand. Where we start getting into problems is if we have pie charts side by side that we're going to compare. So broadly speaking, I can see that coffee has dropped off in the sales relative to the whole, maybe tea's increased. I can't really tell if the pie chart's got bigger, indicating the overall sales are more. I feel like I need to get my protractor out and my ruler and go back to school for a maths lesson. Again, I see a lot of these in annual reports, but there it's more to give a broad idea. If we're actually using them for a useful purpose, for example, making decisions or understanding our performance, this level of detail isn't particularly helpful. So what we have a tendency to do is add some numbers, just like on my line graph. So now what I've got is some numbers on a pie chart, and the point of a pie chart, which is showing me my broad split, is kind of being lost. And I'll actually argue now what we have, rather than some nice pie charts, we've just got a really badly laid out table. Whereas this table would be a much better, clearer way of doing it. So whenever I see a pie chart, my instinct is to say, actually, would we be better off just capturing it as a table instead? Now this table could be improved if I move my columns around to make my most relevant one, which I'm assuming is 2015, the one to the far left. And if I reordered these, maybe put coffee at the top because coffee is the biggest number, as we did before, and maybe add a leading title at the top as well. But I think people tend to shy away from tables because they aren't visual. They think, particularly maybe non-finance people, would prefer to see a graph. But actually, if we need the detail, we need the detail. So as I said before, a table is a better way of presenting it. So all of those charts I can live with. I'm not a big fan of cluster charts. I'm really not a big fan of stacked bar charts. But I can live with them. I can live with pie charts. I quite like pie charts. I love line charts. The ones I really can't live with are 3D graphs. I hate 3D graphs. Again, this one's been auto-formatted by Excel, and then I've just popped it into the slide. The colours are quite nice. It's quite clean. There's a lot of white space. But I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what's going on with my little hot chocolate down the back. We can still see it. If there was something smaller behind it, if we had 4 columns rather than 3, it would get completely lost. And actually my bigger problem is, because of the 3D effect, I'm having to sort of work out what that column would be if it was pushed back against that line. So it's hard to see the actual numbers as well. So I would always avoid 3D graphs. Now the pushback I've had on that from various people in the past is that the reason we use the 3D graph is because we have lots of different elements of data that we need to try and explain in one place. And I can understand that. I can understand that you might want to be showing several different things all in one graph. But it's confusing for the reader. And if you're trying to make life easy for the reader, and particularly if you're dealing with people who aren't used to looking at this information, trying to make it less intimidating, it's much better to keep it simple and have one message or 2 messages per graph. So if you feel the urge to use a 3D graph, what I do is I would step back and say, what are you trying to communicate? And would it be better to communicate that through 3 or 4 maybe small, neat, simple line graphs than having a more complex skyscraper that we have here? Now, just to give you one more example of why I dislike 3D graphs so much, I'm going to show you a picture of a couple of buildings. Now, this is based on an article I read last year that was talking about London office rents, and it was in a magazine. So again, the main purpose was maybe to engage and entertain rather than necessarily be accurately informative. But they used a graphic similar to this to indicate how much rents have increased in London. So let me just ask you my last poll of the day. Looking at my two diagrams, how much do you think rent has increased by in London over the period they were talking about? I'm going to give you a few moments to respond to those again. Most of you have voted. I'll keep it open just for a couple more seconds. And then let's close that down and I will share with you the results. So 50% of you, sorry, 35% of you said times 4, 41 times 2, 6% said times 8, and 18% didn't know. So I'm in there with the 6%. I looked at this and I thought, well, that's really obvious. They've doubled the width, they've doubled the depth, and they've doubled the height. So that must mean times 8. The volume's increased by 8, therefore that's what they must mean. Now, obviously they didn't mean that. What they actually meant was times 2. It was indicating it doubled in that period, which is pretty big anyway. But they hadn't really thought about how people were going to interpret that graphic. And the fact that I got a range of different answers from you guys suggests that actually that wasn't the best way of trying to explain that. That's quite an extreme example, as that it was from a magazine supplement. But the same point is true generally when we use 3D graphics or 3D graphs. They can be misleading and they can mean different things to different people. So I would avoid them. So it's just a few thoughts on graphs, and as I said, this is a huge subject, and I'm just picking up on a few points I commonly see people do that I think if we fix them could make the figures that we present more effective. What I'd like to do now is just spend a couple of minutes thinking about colour. You can see that my buildings here are grey. That's partly because they sit for branding and they sit for colours they like to use, but partly because grey is a brilliant colour and vastly underused in my opinion. So actually, let's just have a quick show of hands. So pop your hands back up if you tend to use colour in your charts, your graphs, or even maybe your tables. A quick show of hands. So I've got quite a few hands going up. And colour's great. You can see that despite the CIPFA, CIPFA got very clear branded colours, but despite that I've used colours on all the graphs that I've been showing so that you can see you can see the different lines. So colour is a really useful thing. But I think there's a couple of caveats we need to have around colour. The first one is, going back to your audience, do your audience like colour? Some people have very strong views. It seems odd, but some people do have very, very strong views about what colours they like and don't like. So particularly if you're working for an organisation that has a colour palette they use, or it's going out to external parties, you need to be a little bit careful. The other thing to think about is your audience and whether any of them are colourblind or colour deficient. So I used to work with an FD of at the time it was a FTSE 100 company, and he was colourblind, as are a significant proportion of people in the country, either colourblind or colour deficient in some way. And what that meant is all those beautiful RAG reports that people would send in with red and green written on them. Actually, he couldn't see any of that because all he could see is effectively the same type of colour. So we need to just be a little bit careful about colour. Red and green commonly can be confused for people who are colourblind. The other thing is you can quite often give people the wrong message when you're using colour. So most of us would think red is bad, green is good, yellow maybe for highlighting. I've been using yellow for highlighting as we've gone through the session today. But what about purple? What about green? Do they mean particular things? Do they have particular importance? So it's important just to make sure that people are clear what you're trying to communicate with colour. If you've got 15 different colours on your spreadsheet, then that's probably not going to be that helpful. If you've got one or two, probably more helpful. The other thing to say about colour is I'm guessing most organisations with cutbacks, etc., don't let you print in colour as much as you'd like to. So you can have a beautiful graph with beautiful colours, and actually you can't see the different colours because you've printed in black and white. So one way to get around this is to actually start off using different shades of grey. And there are quite literally 50 shades of grey that you can use, and I love grey. And you can see here, all we've done is we've used different depth or tones of grey to distinguish between different parts of the rainbow. Now, if you do want to use colour, that's fine, but what I suggest you do is you use, let's see if I can go back to my rainbow. You try to use colours with different intensities. The ones I've got here on my rainbow are all similar intensity, and that means when it prints out, they're going to be quite hard to distinguish. But if you've got a bright red and then maybe a paler green, then that's going to be easy to pick out when it's black and white. But personally, I would stick to grey because grey is great and there's no worries about it printing out wrong. If it looks good on the screen, it should print out fine. So just some thoughts on colour. Colour is a great thing as long as we're sensible with it. What else to say? Well, there's some best practice formatting it's probably worth highlighting that apply whether you're looking at slides or reports or tables or graphs. So I'm just going to flag a few of them, and I think we've already talked about some of them already. But probably my top one is leave white space. It makes things easier to read. It highlights things more clearly if it's not cluttered with text. And actually, if you look back at some of the slides we've used for the graphs and the tables, there is generally quite a lot of white space in them. As I said, Excel's default these days is to leave a bit more white space in the graphs rather than having those heavy grid lines. If you're using an older version of Excel or it's set up with slightly different defaults, you can tinker with them to make that better. Avoid our heavy grid lines, so keep them pale, like the tube map. My tube map, which I've got on my phone, has got very pale, very fine blue lines that doesn't get in the way of the main data, which is those actual lines of the underground itself. Also keep labels to a minimum. So rather than, for example, along the axis, labelling every 1 or every 10, can I do it every 100? Fewer labels mean you've got more white space, it's easier to read, and also it means, again, you can shrink down those graphs much smaller, which means you can drop them into the body of a text of a report, and you don't have to put them in the appendix. Also, I think it's a really good idea to use a sans serif font. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a sans serif font is like the one you see on the screen. I think this is Verdana, other examples of Arial or Calibri. A serif font would be something like Times New Roman, where you've got all the twiddly bits. That's a serif font, and that's a slightly badly drawn sans serif font. Now, the reason I say use sans serif fonts is they are clear, they are more legible when they're shrunk down to a small size. So particularly when you're doing things like labelling graphs or using a table and you're going to shrink it down, they are really useful. What I see a lot of actually though is people using the serif, the sans serif fonts like Arial and Calibri in the text of a report because they think it looks cleaner, more modern. Studies, and I'm never sure where these studies come from, but studies have shown that the serif fonts, so the ones with the twiggly bits, are actually easier to read when you're doing continuous text. So by all means use Times New Roman when you're writing a report, but then when you drop in a table or a graph, just switch that round and use the sans serif fonts. Keep things simple, so 1, maybe 2 messages per table or per graph. And if you can keep those tables and graphs near relevant text, that's going to make it easier for the reader, less likely to cause confusion because they're flicking backwards and forwards. Okay, I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, so just a few more quick things. Would you write 432,236,465 and 50 pence, or would you write 432.2 million? I'm guessing most of you would do the latter, and that's great. But just the fact that rounding is a really good thing. And the reason it's important to round is, first of all, very few people can remember more than 2 or 3 digits. So I have those people out there, and I had one on a course last year who could memorize something like 20 or 30 digits in the space of a couple of seconds. That's not most of us. Most of us can do a 3 or 4. So actually it's less intimidating to just to have those few digits. Less intimidating, we're more likely to remember them, we're more likely to be able to do quick sums with them, so divide it by 12, add it to another number of the similar sort of size. The other thing though, is if you give someone, particularly non-finance people who may not understand where the numbers come from, if you give them something like this, that looks like a really accurate number. And actually, if it's coming from an estimate, it's a budget that's put together maybe with a number of different assumptions, it's those assumptions that are driving that number. And we're not saying that number is actually going to be that, because we're not saying it's that level of accuracy. So sometimes it can give you a misleading idea of accuracy if you have numbers down to the decimal point. So round them. There are many good reasons why rounding is useful. Would you write 4 categories or 4 categories? And would you write 12 categories or 12 categories? I'm not going to open a poll on this. And this is one from the grammar book, so I'll tell you the right answer. And that is, you'd write 4 categories, so you'd write out the word up to 10. But for numbers larger than 10, you'd write the figure. The exception is if you start a sentence, so let's say we start a sentence 12 categories, in that case you'd write the word. Now frankly, I don't care that much. I'm not a grammar pedant. I really don't mind how you write things. You might have a house style. But I think what can be a bit confusing, and actually just looks a bit unprofessional, is if you're inconsistent within the same report on how you write your numbers. So just bear that in mind as well. Okay, just to round this off, what I'd like to do is spend a couple of minutes thinking about slides. Now, don't read the words on the slide, that's just there to illustrate my point. But often when we're presenting our numbers, we are doing it on slides. And what I see time and time again is that we get slides with loads of bullet points on, and it's not just one slide, it's 30, 40 slides repeating the same pattern. Now, I'm pretty sure that you've all stopped listening to me and you're all reading what's on that slide, despite the fact I asked you not to. And that's the problem with having a lot of information on a slide. You stop listening to the person and you're just reading the slide, which means I can't pull out the key points for you, and the information is less effectively communicated because you're presented with a bunch of data that you're not sure what you're going to be taking away as the key points. So, lots of words on a slide is a bad thing. I think most of us recognise that, but we're all still guilty of doing it. Probably this is a more common slide, bullet points again, not full sentences, same information but a bit summarised. But I have the same problem with this as I had with the previous slide. Actually, people are going to reading a slide, you're not adding anything, it's hard to pull out what the key information is. Just got a lower word count, but not necessarily a better slide. So a potential alternative way of presenting the same information could be something like this. And I like this for reports as well as presentations. Actually, I use this quite a lot in reports. And all I've done is I've pulled out what we call the pull quotes, so the key bits of information, and then I've expanded on it there. So slightly different format, slightly easier to pull out the key points. Or you could go even further, and you could get rid of the rest of the text completely, put the key points on the slide, and then you can just talk around the other things. Information isn't presented and numbers aren't presented effectively if you're just dumping everything you know on a slide and actually not summarising, not pulling out the key information. I always think it's much better to use a slide just as a prompt. And if you need the detail, which you probably will, have that as a handout that people can read at their leisure, can read without putting their glasses on and they're not squinting at the screen that you're standing in front of. Okay, so I'm conscious that was a real whistle-stop tour through some thoughts about presenting numbers effectively. As I said, it's a huge, huge subject that I could talk about for quite literally days. What I've tried to do is pull out some key points that you might then be able to take away and just implement and start making things look a bit cleaner. So we talked about the importance of the audience, what they need to know, whether they're an expert, whether they're an executive, whether they're a novice, to think about the kind of level that you need to present that. The drive should always be what they need to know, and also what are the key information that you need them to take away. We've talked a little bit about the structure and format of tables. I talked about getting rid of grid lines and making them a bit clearer, but also about restructuring your tables to highlight the most important information. A bit about numbers. I told you the graphs I liked and I didn't graphs and some caveats around those, and also some thoughts on colour, how we can make our slides a bit easier to read and a bit more relevant, and then just a couple of thoughts on some best practicing formatting. So again, sorry that was a bit of a whiz, but it is a big subject. Thank you very much for attending. I'm just looking down. I don't think we've got any questions that we haven't answered, but if you do think of any, I will stay online for a couple more minutes, so please do feel free to jot them in the question box, or I'll put all the hands down. If you want to raise your hand, then I can unmute you. If not, thank you very much for attending this webinar, and feel free to have a look on the webinar website or contact CIPFA. There are some more upcoming webinars, and I'm hoping that I will see you on one of those in the future. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to hearing or seeing your name on a webinar again soon. Thank you.